Picture this. It's 1999, and you're settling in after the Super Bowl to watch a brand new animated series. The Griffin family appears on screen for the first time. Peter Griffin is in his early 40s, working at a toy factory. Lois is a piano teacher in her late 30s. Their teenage daughter Meg is navigating high school. Chris is a chubby middle schooler. And baby Stewie is plotting world domination from his crib. Fast forward to today. It's been over 25 years since that first episode aired. Peter Griffin is still in his early 40s, working at the Pawtucket Brewery. Lois still teaches piano and looks exactly the same. Meg is still a teenager dealing with high school drama. Chris remains eternally in middle school or early high school. And Stewie, still a baby, still plotting, still exactly 1 year old. More 25 years have passed in our world. Entire generations of viewers have been born, grown up, graduated college, gotten married, and had kids of their own while watching Family Guy. The show has aired over 400 episodes across more than 20 seasons. Technology has evolved from VHS tapes and dial-up internet to streaming services and smartphones. Pop culture has transformed completely. Presidents have come and gone. The world has fundamentally changed in countless ways. But in Quahog, Rhode Island, time moves differently. Or rather, it doesn't move at all. The Griffin family exists in a perpetual present, aging maybe a year or two at most, despite decades passing in the real world. And they're not alone. The Simpsons have been frozen at their respective ages since 1989, and the kids from South Park have been in 4th grade for over 25 years. American Dad Stan Smith has fought the war on terror for nearly 2 decades without adding a single grey hair. This is the world of the floating timeline. And today, we're going to dive deep into why Family Guy characters never age. We'll explore the mechanics behind this phenomenon, the creative decisions that make it necessary, the mind-bending contradictions it creates, and what it reveals about animated television as a whole. Because once you start pulling at this thread, the entire fabric of Quahog begins to unravel in fascinating ways. The fundamental problem is simple to state but impossible to solve. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33. According to early episodes, Peter Griffin was born on July 10th, 1956. Do the math, and Peter would have been 42 or 43 when the show started. That tracks perfectly with how he's portrayed in the early seasons. He's a middle-aged dad, past his prime, dealing with the realities of family life and blue-collar work. But here's where things get weird. If Peter was born in 1956, and we're watching in 2026, Peter Griffin should be 70 years old right now. Not early 40s, not middle-aged, 70. He should be collecting Social Security, dealing with Medicare, probably retiring or already retired. His kids should be adults with families of their own. Meg should be in her 40s, Chris in his late 30s. Even baby Stewie would be 27 years old, possibly with a career, maybe even a family. Instead, the show pretends none of this matters. Episodes from 2024 show Peter still working at the brewery and still drinking at the Drunken Clam with his buddies, still getting into absurd adventures like he's the same guy from 1999. And the show has never acknowledged this impossible situation, except through occasional meta-jokes that wink at the audience without ever actually addressing the core issue. The age problem extends beyond just the passage of time. It's the cultural references, the technology, the specific dated events that the show includes, without any concern for continuity. In early episodes, the Griffins use VHS tapes, have a tube television, and Peter works at a toy factory. Fast forward a few seasons, and suddenly they have flat-screen TVs, smartphones, and access to modern streaming services. The technology updates to match our contemporary world, but the characters remain frozen at their original ages. Let's get specific about how jarring these technological updates become. In Season 1, the Griffin family watches movies on VHS. Peter has to rewind tapes. The TV in their living room is a massive cathode ray tube that probably weighs more than Meg. When they want to look something up, they use encyclopedias or go to the library. If someone needs to make a phone call, they use the landline mounted on the kitchen wall with its coiled cord. By Season 10, smartphones have infiltrated Quahog. Characters text each other constantly. They Google information instantly. They take selfies and post on social media. The living room TV has transformed into a massive flat screen. Streaming services get referenced. Characters watch YouTube videos. The entire technological landscape has evolved to match 2010's reality. Then, by Season 20, we're in full modern tech territory. Characters use apps for everything. They reference TikTok and Instagram. They deal with internet culture and online drama. Video calls are commonplace. Smart home devices respond to voice commands. The technology has caught up to our current moment, despite the characters themselves being unchanged from 1999. This creates a fascinating paradox where the Griffins exist simultaneously in 1999 and 2026. They have the cultural memory and life experiences of people who lived through the 1990s, but they interact with technology and cultural touchstones from the present day. Peter can reference his childhood in the 1960s, while also being familiar with memes from 2024. The show wants characters to feel contemporary, while keeping them frozen at ages that would make them elderly if time progressed normally. And think about the pop culture references. Early Family Guy episodes made jokes about things happening in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Monica Lewinsky. Y2K. Dial-up internet. The show was deeply rooted in its time period. Episodes from the first few seasons are time capsules of turn-of-the-millennium American culture, filled with references that made sense in 1999 but feel dated now. But then later episodes reference Obama's presidency, Trump's presidency, TikTok, COVID-19, and contemporary events from the 2020s. The show treats events from 2008 and events from 2024 as equally recent, even though 16 years separate them. Characters discuss current controversies and trending topics as if everything is happening in the same temporal moment. The world inside the show evolves to stay current with our reality, but the people living in that world don't age accordingly. This means characters have impossibly broad cultural knowledge spanning decades. They remember cultural moments from the 1970s with the clarity of someone who lived through them as an adult, but they also know about viral videos from last week. Their cultural memory is too extensive for their physical ages. Consider the political references. Early episodes might joke about Bill Clinton or George W. Bush. Then the show moves through Obama jokes, Trump jokes, and jokes about contemporary political figures. If we track these references chronologically, they span nearly 3 decades of American political history. But the characters haven't aged 3 decades. They've barely aged 3 years. The show also references major historical events as if they happened recently, even when they didn't. Episodes might treat 9/11 as a fresh wound requiring sensitivity, while also making cavalier jokes about it as something that happened long ago. The temporal distance from events keeps shifting based on what the joke requires, with no concern for internal consistency. Music references create similar problems. Characters know songs from every decade without explanation. Peter can sing along to 1960s rock, 1980s pop, 1990s grunge, and 2020s hip-hop with equal familiarity. His musical knowledge spans nearly 7 decades, which only makes sense if he's much older than his apparent age suggests. But he's not allowed to be older because that would break the show's premise. Movies and television show similar temporal confusion. That the Griffins reference TV shows that went off the air decades ago as if they just watched them. They discuss movies from the 1970s with the enthusiasm of someone who saw them in theaters recently. But they also stay current with whatever films are playing in theaters right now, creating an impossible situation where their entertainment consumption spans half a century. The holidays present another weird aspect of the timeline problem. Family Guy has done multiple Christmas episodes across its 25-year run. Each one treats it as just another Christmas for the Griffin family, with no acknowledgement that they've celebrated Christmas 25 times now without aging. The same applies to Thanksgiving, Halloween, and other recurring holidays that should mark the passage of years but don't. And if we counted Christmas episodes as actual years passing in the show's universe, the Griffin kids would be adults by now, just from the holiday episodes alone. But the show treats each holiday as a fresh experience, with no cumulative weight from all the previous identical celebrations. It's like Groundhog Day stretched across decades, where the same annual traditions repeat infinitely without moving the characters forward in time. Weather and seasons create additional confusion. Quahog experiences winter, spring, summer, and fall across different episodes. These seasons should mark the passage of time, with years cycling through their natural progression. But characters never comment on how many summers or winters they've experienced. The seasons are just backdrops for stories, not markers of time's passage. Our episodes set during specific times of year don't build on each other chronologically. A summer episode from season 5 doesn't happen before a winter episode from season 6 in any meaningful way. The show can jump between seasons freely because it's not tracking actual calendar time. Summer and winter exist simultaneously in a perpetual now. Real-world events that should be impossible for characters to have experienced together somehow coexist in their memories. Peter might reference living through the Vietnam War era as a child, while also having clear memories of playing Nintendo as a kid in the 1980s, while also remembering the 1990s as his young adult years. All of these time periods get compressed into a single childhood/young adulthood that couldn't have spanned all those decades. And the show occasionally tries to handwave these contradictions with quick jokes or throwaway lines that acknowledge the temporal impossibility. A character might say something like, "I remember the 70s." And another character responds, "You weren't alive in the 70s. Creating a brief moment of confusion before the show moves on without resolving anything. These meta-comments acknowledge the problem exists, but refuse to address it seriously. Fashion creates another visible marker of time that the show struggles with. Early episodes show characters wearing distinctly late 1990s style clothing. As the show continues, background characters and guest stars update to contemporary fashion, but the main family's basic wardrobe remains the same. Peter still wears his white shirt and green pants. Lois keeps her purple shirt and tan pants, and the kids maintain their established looks. This creates a situation where the Griffin family dresses like it's 1999, while everyone around them has updated to current styles. In reality, someone wearing the same basic outfit for 25 years would look increasingly out of touch and dated. But animated characters can maintain the same look indefinitely, without it seeming weird, because that's how animation works. Hairstyles present similar issues. Peter's style hasn't changed, despite multiple decades of shifting fashion trends. In real life, a person keeping the exact same haircut from 1999 to 2026 would look increasingly odd as styles evolved around them. But animated characters can freeze their appearance without the audience noticing, because we accept that cartoon characters simply look however they look. The show's willingness to reference its own long run creates additional temporal weirdness. Characters occasionally make jokes about how long the show has been on the air, acknowledging that Family Guy has existed for decades. But these meta-jokes exist alongside the pretense that the characters themselves haven't aged those decades. The show wants credit for longevity, while denying the passage of time within its universe. News events referenced in the show create a detailed timeline of when episodes were produced. An episode referencing a specific news story from 2015 was obviously made around 2015. An episode discussing 2020 events was made around 2020. But the characters don't age between these episodes, creating the impossible situation where Peter Griffin exists in both 2015 and 2020, at the same age, despite 5 years passing in reality. This becomes particularly absurd when looking at multi-part episodes or episodes that directly reference previous episodes. The show wants to have continuity when it's convenient for storytelling, acknowledging that time has passed between episodes and events have occurred in order. But it also wants to maintain that no real time has passed and characters remain unchanged. These contradictory impulses create a timeline that can't be mapped coherently. This creates some absolutely bonkers contradictions when you examine specific episodes. There are flashback episodes showing when Peter and Lois first met, when they got married, when their kids were born, and these flashbacks originally placed events in the 1970s and 1980s, which made perfect sense for the show's 1999 premiere. But as years passed and the show kept making new flashback episodes, these origin stories kept shifting forward in time to maintain the illusion that the characters are still their established ages. One episode might show Peter and Lois as teenagers in the 1970s, grooving to disco and dealing with Vietnam-era America. Another episode made years later shows them as teenagers in the 1980s, referencing Reagan and the Cold War. Then another episode shifts their youth to the 1990s, complete with grunge music and Clinton-era politics. The show literally rewrites its own history to keep the timeline flexible, and it doesn't care that these versions contradict each other. This isn't a mistake or sloppy writing, and it's a deliberate creative choice called a floating timeline. And understanding why Family Guy uses this device requires us to look at how animation works, why episodic sitcoms need consistency, and what happens when you try to maintain a show for decades without letting characters age naturally. The concept of a floating timeline isn't unique to Family Guy. In fact, Seth MacFarlane and his team didn't invent this approach at all. They borrowed it from a much older source that pioneered the technique and proved it could work for animated television. The Simpsons, which premiered a full decade before Family Guy in 1989, established the template that every long-running animated sitcom would follow. The Simpsons' floating timeline is even more extensive and complicated than Family Guy's, because the show has been running for over 35 years now. Think about that. The Simpsons premiered when many current viewers' parents were children themselves. The show has outlasted entire generations, remaining on the air through massive cultural shifts, technological revolutions, and fundamental changes to how television itself works. Homer and Marge Simpson were born in the 1950s, according to early episodes. Their childhoods were set against the backdrop of the 1960s, with Homer growing up during the hippie era and Marge navigating the social changes of that decade. Episodes like The Way We Was from 1991 established this timeline clearly, showing Homer and Marge meeting in high school in 1974, complete with era-appropriate fashion, music, and cultural references. But here's where things get complicated. As The Simpsons continued through the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and into the 2020s, those flashback episodes kept getting made. And each new wave of flashbacks had to shift the timeline forward to maintain the illusion that Homer and Marge could still plausibly be in their late 30s or early 40s in whatever year the current episode aired. So episodes from the 2000s started showing Homer and Marge as teenagers in the 1980s instead of the 1970s. Homer went from being a hippie-era kid to a Reagan-era teen. Marge's fashion updated from bell-bottoms and go-go boots to leg warmers and big hair. The cultural references shifted from Vietnam War protests to MTV and the Cold War. Then episodes from the 2000s pushed the timeline even further, and showing Homer and Marge as young adults in the 1990s. Homer's youth got moved forward again, with him now experiencing grunge music, the rise of the internet, and Clinton-era politics during his formative years. Every decade that passes requires another retcon of the characters' histories to maintain age consistency with the show's eternal present. The most egregious example might be the season 19 episode That 90s Show from 2008, which completely rewrote Homer and Marge's backstory. In this version, they were a young couple in the mid-1990s, with Homer in a grunge band and Marge working as, well, doing 1990s things. The episode fundamentally contradicted everything established about their past in earlier seasons. Fans immediately noticed the contradiction. Lisa's First Word, an episode from 1992, or had shown Lisa being born in 1984 based on contextual clues about the Olympic Games and other cultural markers. If Lisa was born in 1984, and Lisa is always 8 years old, then the current year in The Simpsons should be 1992 eternally. But the show clearly takes place in whatever year it's currently being broadcast, making it impossible for Lisa to have been born in 1984. The show even acknowledges its own contradictions through occasional meta-jokes. In That 90s Show, Lisa uses a calculator to determine that Bart should have been born much later than the show has always claimed, based on when Homer and Marge got together in this new version of events. The show is openly admitting it's rewriting its own history and doesn't care about consistency. Simpsons showrunner Matt Selman addressed this directly in interviews, and he told IGN that the show was never meant to have a linear timeline. We don't have the stresses of other shows, of having them to be serialized or having an arc for the season. We're a real old-school 90s show, where every episode could be the first episode of The Simpsons. Every episode could be the last episode of The Simpsons. We're not really married to continuity, although some people love continuity. Every episode is its own little mini-movie, This philosophy of each episode being standalone is crucial to understanding the floating timeline. The Simpsons treats continuity as optional, something to use when convenient, and ignore when inconvenient. This allows maximum flexibility for storytelling, but creates absolute chaos when you try to construct any coherent chronology, and the show's approach to Grandpa Simpson's military service illustrates the problem perfectly. Grandpa Abraham Simpson fought in World War II, which is established in numerous episodes. He has stories about D-Day, encounters with Hitler, and various wartime adventures. World War II ended in 1945. If Grandpa was old enough to fight in World War II, let's say he was 18 in 1945. He'd have been born in 1927. That would make him 99 years old today in 2026. Yet Grandpa is consistently portrayed as being in his 70s or 80s, elderly, but not impossibly ancient. The show needs him to have fought in World War II for storytelling purposes, but it also needs him to be a relatively young senior citizen rather than on the verge of turning 100. The solution is to simply not address the math. Grandpa fought in World War II, and Grandpa is in his 70s. These two facts exist simultaneously, even though they're chronologically impossible. The show trusts that most viewers won't do the calculation, or will accept the temporal vagueness as part of animation's fantastical nature. Principal Skinner presents another military timeline problem. He's a Vietnam War veteran, with his service in Vietnam being a core part of his character. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. If Skinner was 18 in 1975, he'd have been born in 1957, making him 69 years old today. But Skinner is consistently shown as middle-aged, probably in his 50s at most. Again, the math doesn't work unless we accept that World War II and Vietnam War service can exist in character backstories, without those wars actually being as far in the past as they are. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old since 1989, and this creates the most visible marker of the floating timeline's absurdity. A real person who was 10 in 1989 would be 47 years old today. They would have lived through childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and be approaching middle age. They'd potentially have children of their own, who are now older than Bart. Instead, Bart remains eternally 10, experiencing 4th grade in an endless loop. He's had multiple 4th grade teachers as the show has cycled through different educational storylines. He's celebrated multiple birthdays across various episodes. He's done things that should have resulted in expulsion or significant life changes. But come next episode, he's back in Mrs. Crubapple's class, until the character was retired after the actress's death, acting like nothing happened. Lisa Simpson, perpetually 8 years old, and has achieved more than most people accomplish in entire lifetimes. She's been a vegetarian since the 1995 episode Lisa the Vegetarian, meaning she's maintained this dietary choice for what feels like 30 years to us, but is less than 1 year to her. She's developed her saxophone skills, had numerous romantic interests, won academic competitions, fought for causes, and grown intellectually in ways that suggest years of development. Yet she hasn't aged a day. Maggie Simpson might have it worst. She's been a baby since 1989. For over 35 years, Maggie has been frozen in infancy, unable to talk, unable to walk independently, still sucking on a pacifier. A baby born when the show premiered would now be 37 years old, potentially with their own children, possibly even with grandchildren. Maggie hasn't progressed beyond infanthood, The show has done episodes showing the Simpson kids at different ages. Lisa's Wedding from 1995 showed Lisa as a college student in the year 2010. But when the actual year 2010 arrived, Lisa was still 8 years old, making that future episode non-canonical, or treating it as one possible future that hasn't happened yet and might never happen. Multiple future episodes have shown Bart and Lisa as adults, Homer and Marge as elderly, and Maggie as a grown woman with a career and family. These futures are always set 25 years from now or 30 years from now, meaning the temporal distance to the future moves forward at the same rate as real time passes. The future is always the same distance away, because the present never progresses. And The Simpsons' floating timeline has created so many contradictions that dedicated fans have created wikis and timelines attempting to make sense of it all. These efforts always fail because the show wasn't designed to have coherent chronology. It was designed to be flexible and adaptable, able to comment on current events while maintaining established character dynamics. One fascinating aspect is how The Simpsons handles technology updates versus character ages. Early episodes showed The Simpsons without computers, using rotary phones, and watching TV on old sets. As real technology evolved, the show gradually updated the Simpson household to include computers, flat-screen TVS, smartphones, and modern conveniences. But this creates timeline problems. If The Simpsons got their first computer in a 1998 episode, and that was a recent purchase in the show's universe. But then, a 2020 episode shows them having always had computers and being familiar with modern technology. When did they actually get the computer? The answer is, whenever the current episode needs them to have gotten it. The show has made multiple jokes about its own longevity and the weirdness of the floating timeline. Characters occasionally make references to how long things have been going on, breaking the fourth wall to acknowledge that The Simpsons has been running for decades. But these acknowledgements exist alongside the fiction that the characters themselves haven't experienced those decades. One episode from 2024 season 36 titled Bart's Birthday promised to finally address the aging problem by actually aging Bart to 11, and the promotional material suggested this might be a permanent change, potentially acknowledging the passage of time. But even if Bart did age 1 year, it would only highlight the absurdity. 1 year in 35 years of runtime isn't aging proportionally. It's still essentially frozen time with a token concession to the concept of aging. The Simpsons also has to deal with real-world deaths of voice actors and celebrity guest stars. When actors die, the show sometimes retires their characters out of respect. This creates a strange situation where mortality exists for characters linked to deceased actors, but other characters remain ageless. Death is real, but aging isn't. Maud Flanders died in the show after a contract dispute with her voice actress. Unlike Brian Griffin's temporary death, Maud stayed dead, and with later episodes dealing with Ned's life as a widower. This proves The Simpsons can handle permanent character death when it chooses to. But it only chooses to when real-world factors force the issue, not as a natural consequence of characters living for 35-plus years. The show's treatment of holidays creates additional temporal confusion. Like Family Guy, The Simpsons has done numerous Christmas episodes, Treehouse of Horror Halloween episodes, and other holiday specials across its run. Each one treats the holiday as just another year for the Simpson family, even though 35 Christmases should mean 35 years have passed. If we counted each Christmas episode as a year, Lisa should be in her 40s by now, based solely on holiday episodes. But the show treats each holiday as a fresh occurrence, with no cumulative weight. The characters don't comment on having celebrated Christmas dozens of times. Each one is treated as relatively novel, or at least no more repetitive than real people experience their annual holidays. The Simpsons pioneered many of the techniques that Family Guy would later adopt. The cutaway gags that Family Guy is famous for have their roots in Simpsons flashbacks and fantasy sequences. The meta-humor about the show's own existence started with The Simpsons. The willingness to sacrifice continuity for the sake of individual episode quality traces back to Simpsons' early seasons. But where The Simpsons at least attempted to maintain some consistency in its early years, Family Guy was more chaotic about continuity from the start. The Simpsons spent its first decade or so trying to keep a relatively coherent timeline before giving up, and Family Guy never pretended to care about strict continuity, instead embracing temporal chaos as part of its identity. Both shows benefit from the animation medium's ability to keep characters looking identical episode after episode. Live-action shows have to deal with actors visibly aging, making it obvious that time is passing even if the show pretends otherwise. Animated characters can look exactly the same for decades, making the illusion of frozen time more sustainable. The commercial success of The Simpsons' floating timeline approach validated it for other animated shows. Once, The Simpsons proved you could run an animated sitcom for decades without aging characters. Networks became comfortable green-lighting similar shows with the expectation of long runs. Family Guy, South Park, American Dad, and others all benefited from The Simpsons establishing the precedent. The floating timeline has become so standard in animated sitcoms that viewers barely question it anymore. We've been trained to accept that animated characters don't age normally. It's part of the genre's conventions, like how no one questions why cartoon characters can survive being flattened by steamrollers or blown up with dynamite. Animation operates by different rules than live action, and frozen ages are part of those rules. But The Simpsons has run so long that even its floating timeline is showing strain. The show has been forced to retcon its own history multiple times to maintain even the illusion of consistency. And episodes now have to reference events from early seasons as happening a long time ago, even though no time has supposedly passed for the characters. The gaps between what the show claims and what viewers know is true has become impossible to ignore. This creates an interesting meta-commentary on entertainment itself. The Simpsons exists as a cultural institution, a show that's been around so long, it's become part of the fabric of American television. But within its own universe, almost no time has passed. The show's cultural longevity exists in tension with its narrative stasis. The Simpsons is both ancient and perpetually young, a paradox that defines its unique place in television history. Family Guy inherited all of these techniques and problems from The Simpsons, while adding its own flavor of meta-humor and temporal chaos. Where The Simpsons at least gestures toward maintaining continuity, Family Guy openly embraces contradiction and inconsistency as part of its comedic style. Both shows use the floating timeline, but Family Guy is more willing to explicitly joke about how nonsensical it is. According to media critic Ros Kavanagh, the floating timeline exists because of the commercial need to keep certain characters going forever. Think about it from a business perspective. Family Guy is a massive franchise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The show generates revenue through advertising, syndication, streaming rights, merchandise, and countless other sources. All of that value is tied directly to the Griffin family as we know them. Peter, the lovable idiot. Lois, the patient wife. Meg, the awkward teenager. Chris, the dim-witted son. Stewie, the diabolical baby. Brian, the intellectual dog. These character dynamics are the foundation of every joke, every storyline, every episode. The show's entire comedic structure depends on these relationships staying exactly as they are. Peter needs to be the middle-aged man-child who makes terrible decisions. Lois needs to be the long-suffering wife trying to keep the family together. Meg needs to be the teenage outcast everyone picks on. Chris needs to be the good-hearted but stupid kid. Stewie needs to be the brilliant baby with adult intelligence trapped in an infant's body. What happens if you let these characters age naturally? Suddenly, the entire formula collapses. Stewie growing up destroys what makes him interesting, and the show has occasionally depicted adult versions of Stewie as flamboyantly gay characters who lack the edge and menace of baby Stewie, suggesting that growing up would fundamentally change what makes him compelling. Meg aging out of high school removes her teenage angst and social struggles. Chris becoming an adult eliminates the innocent stupidity that makes his character work. Peter getting older means he can't be the irresponsible man-child anymore. He'd just be a sad old man making bad choices. The commercial reality is brutal and simple. Networks need shows that can run for decades generating consistent revenue. Advertisers need predictable audiences who tune in for familiar characters. Streaming services need content libraries that remain relevant and rewatchable. None of that works if your main characters age out of the roles that made them popular in the first place. This is where academic Kevin Warner's observation becomes relevant. He compared superheroes in comics to mythological figures, noting that sliding timescales in comics function similarly to how ageless figures in myths interact with the contemporary world of the storyteller. The Greek gods never aged, never changed their fundamental nature, but the stories about them could be updated to reflect whatever was happening in ancient Greek society at the time. Batman first appeared in 1939, but he's been continuously updated to fight crime in whatever decade the story is being told, always remaining about 35 years old, despite 85 years passing in our world. Family Guy characters operate the same way. They're modern American archetypes that exist outside normal time, allowing writers to tell stories about contemporary issues through well-defined character perspectives that never fundamentally change. Peter represents a certain type of American working-class masculinity. Lois embodies the patient wife archetype. The kids represent different aspects of growing up. These roles need to stay consistent for the comedy to work, even as the specific details of modern life evolve around them. Seth MacFarlane addressed this directly in a 2022 Hollywood Reporter interview, celebrating the show's 400th episode. When asked about the show's longevity, showrunner Rich Appel explained their production cycle. Family Guy episodes take 12 to 14 months to produce from initial concept to finished animation. This isn't a late-night show that can respond to yesterday's news. It's a slow, methodical process that requires writers to think about what will still be relevant a year after they write the script. MacFarlane himself chimed in, noting that this long production cycle is actually an advantage for the show's sustainability. It forces the writers to focus on timeless character-based comedy rather than trying to chase every trending topic. And crucially, he stated that because the characters don't age, the show can explore issues and situations through extremely well-defined points of view. Those character perspectives remain consistent decade after decade. giving viewers a stable lens through which to view an ever-changing world. This reveals something fundamental about why animated sitcoms use floating timelines, and it's not laziness or lack of creativity. It's a recognition that certain types of storytelling require stability. The Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, and similar shows aren't trying to tell serialized coming-of-age stories where characters grow and evolve over time. They're telling episodic comedies where each episode presents a new situation for established characters to react to in their characteristic ways. The appeal of these shows is seeing how Peter Griffin, specifically, would handle a situation, not watching Peter Griffin change as a person. Fans tune in because they know what they're getting. They want to see Peter do something idiotic, Lois try to fix it, Meg suffer through teenage hell, Chris be lovably dumb, and Stewie engage in elaborate schemes. That formula works precisely because it's consistent and reliable. But this creative choice creates some absolutely wild inconsistencies and contradictions that become more glaring the longer the show runs. And nowhere is this more apparent than when you look closely at Peter Griffin himself, the center of the entire series, whose age problem encapsulates everything weird about Family Guy's relationship with time. Peter Griffin's age is a beautiful disaster of contradictions that perfectly illustrates how the floating timeline works and why it creates such bizarre situations. Let's trace through the various birth years and ages that have been established for Peter across the show's run, because the numbers simply don't add up, no matter how you slice them. In early episodes, particularly those from the original 1999 to 2002 run, Peter's birth year was implicitly set as 1956. The episode A Picture's Worth $1,000 from season 2 shows Peter celebrating a birthday, and contextual clues from other early episodes suggested he was born in the mid-1950s. This would make him 42 or 43 when the show premiered, which fits perfectly with how he's portrayed. He's a middle-aged guy, past his physical prime, dealing with a dad bod and the realities of family life in his 40s. But then you have other episodes that contradict this. In Meet the Quagmires, an episode from 2007 that involves time travel, Peter is transported back to when he was 18 years old in 1984. If Peter was 18 in 1984, that means he was born in 1966, not 1956. That's a full 10-year difference. This would make Peter only 33 when the show premiered in 1999, which doesn't match his appearance or how he's characterized at all. He's clearly meant to be middle-aged, not in his early 30s. Then there's the episode Padre de Familia, where Peter discovers he was born in Mexico City during a botched abortion attempt by his mother. The birth certificate shown in the episode lists his birth name as Justin Peter Griffin, but different episodes have given different dates. The Family Guy fan and wiki lists Peter as born July 10th, 1965 in some timelines, which would make him 34 when the show started. Another popular fan calculation puts him at born in 1954, making him 45 in 1999. The show has also explicitly stated Peter's current age at various points, and these numbers create their own problems. In Brian Does Hollywood, Stewie mentions that Peter is 42 while they're auditioning for Kids Say the Darndest Things. This episode aired in 2001 and the show's third season. If Peter was 42 in 2001, he'd be 65 years old today in 2026, but he's still portrayed as being in his 40s. Some episodes have had Peter reference being 43. Others have suggested he's in his mid-40s. The show deliberately keeps this vague because pinning down an exact age would expose the fundamental impossibility of the premise. Peter can't be a specific age because that would mean he'd have to age in real time, which would break the entire format of the show. What makes this even more confusing is how the show handles Peter's past. We've seen extensive flashbacks to Peter's childhood, his teenage years, his young adult life, and his early marriage to Lois. These flashbacks originally placed Peter's youth in the 1960s and 1970s, and The Way We Was style episodes showed Peter growing up in an era of Vietnam War protests, disco, and the cultural tumult of that period. But as the show continued into the 2000s and 2010s, new flashback episodes started shifting Peter's youth forward. Some episodes showed Peter as a teenager in the 1980s, complete with references to Reagan, the Cold War, and MTV. Then later episodes pushed it even further, showing Peter's formative years happening in the 1990s, with grunge music, the rise of the internet, and Clinton-era references. The show literally rewrites Peter's personal history every few years to maintain the illusion that he could plausibly be in his mid-40s right now. If Peter was a teenager in the 1970s, he'd be elderly by now, so the show retcons his past to say he was a teenager in the 1980s instead. But wait, and that still makes him too old for the current timeline. So they shifted again to the 1990s, and presumably, as we move further into the 2020s and 2030s, future flashback episodes will show Peter as a teenager in the 2000s, even though we watched the show during that time period when he was already an adult. This creates a recursive paradox where the show's past eats itself. Family Guy has been on the air long enough that its own continuity contradicts itself. Episodes from the early 2000s showed Peter's past one way. Episodes from the 2000s showed his past differently. Episodes from the 2000s are showing it yet another way. And all of these versions are considered equally valid because the show operates on a floating timeline where nothing is truly permanent except the characters' current ages and relationships. And Peter's work history compounds this problem. When the show started, Peter worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory. Then he was working at the Pawtucket brewery. Then he had various other jobs across different episodes. The brewery job became his permanent position, but the show has never explained how long he's worked there, or how these job changes fit into any coherent timeline. If we're meant to believe Peter has worked at the brewery for years, and each season of the show represents roughly 1 year of time in universe, then Peter should have aged significantly over the show's run, but he hasn't. Or if each episode is meant to be self-contained with no linear time progression, then how do we account for the explicit references to past episodes and character development that does carry forward? The show wants to have it both ways, and it wants to be able to reference past events and build on previous storylines, creating a sense of continuity in history. But it also wants to reset everything so the characters never change, never age, never face permanent consequences. This contradiction is most visible with Peter because he's the main character, the center of almost every storyline, the lens through which we view Quahog. One Screen Rant article pointed out that Peter Griffin, if he aged normally from his apparent birth year in the show's early seasons, should be pushing 60 or even 70 years old by now. Instead, he remains perpetually in his mid-40s, still acting like an overgrown child, still making catastrophically bad decisions, still drinking at the Drunken Clam like no time has passed at all. And the article noted that this floating timeline allows Family Guy and The Simpsons to include real-life events and modern-day references without breaking the timeline. But it also means the show operates in a kind of eternal present, where history is constantly being rewritten and characters exist outside normal causality. This brings up an interesting question. If Peter doesn't age, and his past keeps shifting to accommodate the present, is he even the same person across episodes? Or is each episode's version of Peter a slightly different character, a variant whose history has been adjusted to fit the current year? It's like the show takes place in a soft multiverse, where the basic facts stay the same, but the details are fluid. Peter Griffin is simultaneously 42 and 70. Born in 1954 and 1966, a teenager in the 1970s and the 1990s, working at the toy factory and the brewery, meeting Lois in high school and at college. All of these versions exist in a quantum superposition until an episode collapses them into whatever state is needed for that particular story. But Peter isn't the only Griffin with an impossible age. His children represent an even more fundamental problem with the floating timeline, because watching kids not grow up is somehow more unsettling than watching adults stay the same age. Kids are supposed to change rapidly, hitting developmental milestones, growing physically, maturing mentally. When they don't, it creates an eerie, frozen-in-time effect that's hard to ignore. Meg Griffin has been stuck in high school hell for over 25 years. When the show started in 1999, Meg was 16 years old, a sophomore or junior at James Woods Regional High School, and she was the unpopular girl, constantly bullied, struggling with her appearance and social status, dealing with all the typical teenage angst that comes with high school. Now here's the thing, Meg has had multiple birthday episodes. There's been acknowledgement within the show that she's celebrating another year of life. Some episodes have even suggested she's aged from 16 to 17 to possibly 18. But she never graduates. She never moves beyond high school. Despite having multiple birthdays over the course of 400 plus episodes, she remains eternally trapped in adolescence. Think about what this means for Meg as a character. She's been dealing with the same high school social hierarchies, the same bullying, the same teenage problems for a quarter century. In real time, a person who was 16 in 1999 would be 43 years old now, and they would have graduated high school, possibly gone to college, started a career, maybe gotten married, perhaps had kids of their own. They would have lived an entire adult life. But Meg is still sitting in high school classrooms, still being rejected by boys, still dealing with Connie D'Amico and the popular girls, still suffering through PE class and cafeteria humiliation. It's like a permanent nightmare where you're stuck repeating high school forever, which honestly might be the darkest thing about the show's premise when you really think about it. Some episodes have acknowledged this in meta ways. There are jokes about Meg being stuck in a certain phase of life. Other characters occasionally make remarks that seem aware of the temporal weirdness, but the show can't address it directly without breaking the fundamental format. Meg has to stay a teenager because teenage daughter everyone dumps on is her role in the family dynamic. If she aged out of that role, the show would have to find a new dynamic, and that would change Family Guy into something different. The same applies to Chris Griffin, though his situation is slightly different. Chris started the series at about 13 or 14 years old, a chubby middle schooler with a good heart but limited intelligence. Over the course of the show, he's maybe aged a year or two, putting him somewhere in the 14 to 15 range, possibly entering high school, but never quite settling there. Chris represents eternal early adolescence. He's got the awkwardness, the bodily changes, the confusion about girls and sexuality, the struggle to find his identity, but he never moves past it, and he's been discovering puberty and dealing with teenage confusion for 2.5 decades. If Chris actually aged in real time, he'd be in his late 30s by now, possibly with teenagers of his own. What's particularly interesting about Chris is that the show has occasionally shown future versions of him. Episodes that flash forward in time have depicted Chris as an adult, usually portrayed as still somewhat dim, but functional enough to hold a job and have relationships. These future episodes acknowledge that Chris could grow up and age normally. They just choose not to let him do so in the show's main timeline. This creates a weird situation where the show admits that time could progress normally and characters could age. But it deliberately prevents this from happening in the real continuity. It's like the show is saying, yes, and we know these people would age in real life, and we can even show you what that would look like, but we're choosing to keep them frozen at these ages for creative reasons. Then there's Stewie Griffin, whose age situation is probably the most absurd of all. Stewie is 1 year old. He's been 1 year old since 1999. He will presumably be 1 year old forever. Despite the show spanning 25 years and 400 plus episodes, Stewie has not aged out of infancy. Now, in fairness, some episodes have shown Stewie having birthdays. There's even an episode titled Chitty Chitty Death Bang from season 1 that revolves around Stewie's first birthday party. The show acknowledges that birthdays happen, but Stewie remains perpetually a baby, still wearing diapers, still small enough to fit in a stroller, still technically an infant, despite having the vocabulary and intelligence of a genius adult. This is where the floating timeline creates its most surreal effect. A human who was born in 1999 would be 27 years old today. They'd be a full adult, possibly with a college degree, a career, relationships, maybe even kids of their own. But Stewie is still playing with toys, still small enough for Lois to carry around, still young enough that it makes sense for him to have a teddy bear named Rupert. Stewie's eternal infancy is crucial to his character. The entire comedy of Stewie comes from the contrast between his baby appearance and his adult intelligence and personality. If Stewie aged normally, he'd become a young child, then a preteen, then a teenager, and eventually an adult. Each stage would fundamentally change the character. A 5-year-old Stewie wouldn't have the same comedic impact. A teenage Stewie would lose the baby genius angle entirely. An adult Stewie would just be a regular character without the central gimmick that makes him interesting. Seth MacFarlane has essentially admitted as much in interviews. The character of Stewie works specifically because he's a baby with adult characteristics. Remove the baby part, and you've lost what makes the character unique. This is the commercial necessity that Roz Cavaney talked about. Stewie can't age because aging would destroy the character's marketability and comedic value. But this creates some deeply weird implications when you think about it too hard. Stewie has been alive for 1 year according to the show's internal logic, but he's experienced at least 400 different adventures, each one presumably taking days or weeks to unfold. How does that work? Is Stewie living multiple lifetimes compressed into a single year? Does time work differently for him than for other characters? There's also the question of what Stewie remembers. If the show truly resets after each episode with no continuity, then Stewie shouldn't remember previous adventures. But he clearly does. He references past events, builds on previous relationships, shows character development across seasons. So he's accumulating experiences and memories, but somehow not accumulating age. This brings us to one of the most significant events in Family Guy's history regarding age and permanence, an event that tested whether the show would ever allow real change and aging to occur. And that event was the death and resurrection of Brian Griffin, and which revealed more about how Family Guy views time, age, and permanence than perhaps any other storyline the show has done. In November 2013, Family Guy shocked its audience by killing off Brian Griffin, the family's anthropomorphic dog, who had been a main character since the show's first episode. The episode Life of Brian didn't just injure Brian or put him in danger. It actually killed him, showing him hit by a car, taken to the veterinary clinic, and dying while the family said their goodbyes. It was played completely straight, with genuine emotion and a funeral scene where Peter gives a tearful eulogy. What made this death significant wasn't just that a main character died, but how it happened and why. The episode begins with Brian and Stewie on a time travel adventure gone wrong. They return to the present day, and Stewie decides he's had enough close calls with death during their temporal adventures. So he destroys his time machine, crushing it at a junkyard, making it impossible to go back and change the past. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, Brian is hit by a car while they're setting up a street hockey net. Because Stewie destroyed the time machine, he can't go back and prevent Brian's death. The episode makes it clear that this is permanent. There's no easy fix, no reset button, no way to undo what happened. Brian is gone. The reaction was immediate and intense. Within hours of the episode airing on November 24th, 2013, fans created petitions demanding Brian's return. One petition on change.org, directed at Seth MacFarlane and Fox Broadcasting, gained thousands of signatures almost instantly, becoming one of the fastest growing entertainment-related petitions on the site. The petition read, "Brian Griffin was an important part of our viewing experience. He added a witty and sophisticated element to the show. Family Guy and Fox Broadcasting will lose viewers if Brian Griffin is not brought back to the show." Some fans got tattoos memorializing Brian, including R.I.P. Brian Inc., demonstrating the strong emotional attachment viewers had to the character. Social media exploded with anger, grief, and disbelief. People were genuinely upset, treating Brian's death like the loss of a real individual rather than a fictional cartoon dog. The show replaced Brian with a new dog named Vinny, an Italian-American street dog with a tough guy accent. Vinny was clearly designed to fill Brian's role in the family dynamic, but fans rejected him almost universally. They didn't want a replacement. They wanted Brian back. Behind the scenes, writer Steve Callahan told E! News about why they decided to kill Brian. Well, this was an idea that got pitched in the writer's room, and it caught fire, and we thought it could be a fun way to shake things up. As soon as this idea came up, we started talking about what the next couple of episodes could be. We got very excited about the way this change will affect the family dynamics and the characters. He explained why they chose Brian specifically. It seemed more in the realm of a reality that a dog would get hit by a car than if one of the kids died. As much as we love Brian, and as much as everyone loves their pets, we felt it would be more traumatic to lose one of the kids rather than the family pet. This explanation suggests how the writers viewed this death. They saw it as a way to shake up the formula, to inject real stakes and emotional weight into a show that typically operates without permanent consequences. Based on Callahan's comments, they wanted to see how the family would cope with genuine loss, how relationships would shift, how grief would affect the characters. But the fan reaction was so intense, so overwhelmingly negative, that the show walked it back relatively quickly. Just 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, which aired December 15th, 2013, Stewie manages to bring Brian back through time travel shenanigans. The plot involves Stewie seeing a past version of himself at the mall, the same Stewie from before Brian died, who was using the time machine to shop early for Christmas presents. Current Stewie realizes he can borrow the past Stewie's return pad to travel back in time and prevent Brian's death. He succeeds, saving Brian from the car at the last second. However, in doing so, current Stewie creates a paradox where he alters his own past, causing his present self to fade from existence. The episode ends on Christmas Day with Brian alive and well, completely unaware that he had died in an alternate timeline. Present Stewie, who saved him, has been erased from existence, though past Stewie continues forward none the wiser. The show returns to status quo with Brian back in his rightful place as the family dog. Seth MacFarlane later commented on Twitter thanking fans for caring so much about the canine Griffin. He is overcome with gratitude. He also admitted to E that they would have to be fucking high to kill Brian permanently, hinting that the death was always planned as a temporary stunt. This entire arc reveals crucial information about how Family Guy views permanence, change, and aging. First, it shows that the writers are aware of and sometimes frustrated by the limitations of their own format. They wanted to do something bold and permanent, something that would genuinely change the show's dynamics. They wanted to prove they could tell stories with real stakes and lasting consequences. But second, it demonstrates that the show is ultimately a prisoner of its own premise. Family Guy operates in a world where nothing can truly change permanently, because the format requires consistency. Killing Brian would have required the show to fundamentally restructure itself. Every Brian Stewie adventure would be gone. The intellectual counterweight to Peter's idiocy would vanish. The show would have to find new ways to deliver certain types of jokes and storylines. The commercial reality appears to have been that changing the show that drastically might alienate viewers and hurt ratings. Fans made it clear they watched Family Guy specifically for the established character dynamics. They didn't want change. They wanted the comfort of familiarity, the same characters having new adventures, but always remaining fundamentally the same. Third, and most relevant to our discussion of aging, the death and resurrection of Brian proves that time in Family Guy is not linear or permanent. The show can and will literally rewrite its own timeline when necessary. Stewie's time machine allowed the show to undo a major event, erasing episodes from continuity and resetting everything back to the preferred status quo. This is the floating timeline taken to its logical extreme. Not only do characters not age, but major events can be undone through temporal manipulation. The show exists in a kind of quantum state, where multiple timelines are possible, and the real version is whichever one the writers currently prefer. It's worth noting that Brian's age has also been handled inconsistently. At the start of the series, Brian was 6 years old in dog years. Various episodes have mentioned him being 7, 8, or even 10 years old. But he never ages beyond young adulthood in appearance or capability, and he doesn't show signs of being elderly or slowing down despite over 25 years passing since the show began. If Brian aged in real dog time, accounting for the faster aging of dogs compared to humans, he'd be long dead by now. Dogs age approximately 7 years for every 1 human year, meaning 25 human years would be equivalent to 175 dog years. Brian should be ancient, decrepit, or deceased from natural causes by now. Instead, he's still drinking martinis, chasing women, and getting into adventures like he's in his prime. The death and resurrection arc was Family Guy's attempt to have its cake and eat it too. The writers wanted the emotional impact of a permanent death and the storytelling possibilities that would come with it. But they also wanted to preserve the show's established formula and character dynamics. The solution was to kill Brian temporarily, generate massive buzz and media attention, then bring him back and pretend the whole thing was a clever twist all along. Critics at the time had mixed reactions. Eric Thurm of the AV Club gave Life of Brian an A-, saying Brian's death scene was actually pretty poignant, coming as close as Family Guy can to genuinely moving, and surprisingly effective at dealing with the sudden death of a main character. But he also noted that the show's typical approach to emotion is hollow, and forcing pathos into Family Guy feels somewhat artificial. Screen Rant was less kind, ranking the episode among the 12 worst Family Guy episodes ever, highlighting the abruptness of Brian's death and the awkward introduction of Vinny. iDistractify noted that while Family Guy has produced both highly praised and poorly received episodes, this one is remembered unfavorably for its emotional missteps. The entire saga became a case study in how floating timelines and episodic sitcoms interact with character death. In shows with continuous narratives and aging characters, death can be meaningful and permanent. But in shows where nothing truly changes and time doesn't move forward, death becomes either impossible or temporary. Family Guy proved it falls into the latter category. This has implications for understanding the show's relationship with age and permanence. If even death can be undone through time manipulation, then aging is obviously off the table. The show exists in a bubble where consequences can always be reversed, where the past can be rewritten, and where the characters are preserved in amber at their established ages, no matter what happens. But Brian isn't the only character whose age creates problems. The show's supporting cast contains some truly mind-bending age contradictions that make Peter's situation look simple by comparison. And these background characters reveal just how absurd Family Guy's floating timeline becomes when you examine it closely. Glenn Quagmire presents one of the most bizarre age problems in the entire series. In various episodes, Quagmire's birth year has been given as 1948, meaning he'd be 78 years old today. Other episodes suggest he was born in the 1950s, or even later. But here's the really wild part. One episode stated Quagmire was born in 1938, which would make him 88 years old currently. Let's sit with that for a moment. Quagmire is Peter's neighbor, his drinking buddy, his contemporary. They hang out at the Drunken Clam together, go on adventures together, and are portrayed as being roughly the same generation. Yet, if we believe the 1938 birth year, Quagmire is actually 30 to 40 years older than Peter. He'd be a senior citizen, eligible for Medicare and Social Security, possibly retired from his pilot career. Instead, Quagmire is portrayed as extremely sexually active, physically fit enough to engage in athletic sex regularly, working as a commercial airline pilot, a job that has mandatory retirement ages, and generally acting like a man in his 40s or 50s at most. The disconnect between his canonical age and his portrayal is staggering. The show has occasionally acknowledged this weirdness. Our episodes have made jokes about Quagmire being older than he looks, or having been around for historical events that would require him to be elderly. but these jokes are treated as throwaway gags rather than serious attempts to address the continuity problem. Then there's Herbert the pervert, the elderly neighbor with a disturbing fixation on young boys, particularly Chris. Herbert is explicitly portrayed as ancient, using a walker, speaking in a shaky old man voice, and making references to decades past. He's meant to be somewhere in his 80s or 90s, based on his appearance and how other characters treat him. But Herbert has been the same age throughout the show's entire run. He was elderly when the show started in 1999, and he's still the same level of elderly 25 years later. If Herbert was 80 in 1999, he'd be 105 now, and which would make him extraordinarily old even by modern standards. Yet he shows no signs of the additional aging that would come with a quarter-century passing. This raises an interesting question about how the floating timeline handles characters who are already old. For young or middle-aged characters, staying the same age means they simply don't age. But for elderly characters, staying the same age means they're defying death itself. Herbert should have died of natural causes years ago given his advanced age when the show started. Instead, he persists, eternally elderly, forever creeping on Chris from across the street. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual actor Adam West, until his real-world death in 2017, presents another case study. The character was portrayed as elderly, eccentric, and often senile, and suggesting he was in his 70s or 80s. He remained that age throughout his time on the show, never becoming more elderly or showing signs of approaching death despite decades passing. When the real Adam West died in 2017, the show had to address what to do with the character. They eventually decided to retire the Mayor Adam West character out of respect for the actor, having him die in the show's universe as well. This is one of the few times Family Guy has allowed permanent death for a main recurring character, and it only happened because the real person behind the voice had passed away. But this creates a weird situation where death from real-world circumstances is permanent, but death within the show's universe can be undone through time travel or simply ignored in future episodes, and the rules of mortality are inconsistent and depend on external factors rather than internal logic. Joe Swanson, Peter's paraplegic neighbor, was supposedly born in 1961, according to some episode references. This would make him 65 years old today, well past the age when most police officers retire. Yet Joe is portrayed as still being an active duty cop, physically capable of the upper body strength required for his job, and generally in good health aside from his paralysis. The show has done several storylines about Joe's disability, his past as a capable officer before his injury, and his struggles with his condition. But it's never addressed that Joe, if he aged normally, would be approaching retirement age by now. He'd be dealing with the physical decline that comes with being a senior citizen, on top of his existing paralysis. How instead, he remains frozen at whatever age he was when the show started, perpetually in his prime years, despite being a grandfather multiple times over in real time. Cleveland Brown, who was spun off into his own series, The Cleveland Show, before returning to Family Guy, has similar age issues. He's Peter's contemporary, meant to be roughly the same age, but the years don't add up when you look at his life history, his children's ages, and how long certain events supposedly happened in his past. Even minor recurring characters show the strain of the floating timeline. Mort Goldman, the neurotic Jewish pharmacist, has been middle-aged throughout the show's run. His son Neil has been a teenager for 25 years. The same applies to Connie D'Amico and the other high school students who populate Meg's storylines. And they're all frozen at their respective ages, despite birthdays, graduations, and other life milestones presumably happening off-screen. The show occasionally makes meta-jokes about these age problems. Characters will make references to being the same age for years, or joke about the passage of time not affecting them. There are cutaway gags that acknowledge the weird timeline, but these jokes are never taken seriously. They're winks to the audience that say, yes, we know this doesn't make sense, but we're going to keep doing it anyway. What's particularly interesting is how the show handles characters dying and then returning without explanation. Hans Moleman-style characters in Family Guy will die in one episode, often in graphic ways, then reappear in later episodes as if nothing happened. The show has essentially established that death is temporary for minor characters, which further undermines any sense of permanence or linear time. This creates a hierarchy of permanence. Main characters like the Griffin family can't die or age. Major recurring characters like Quagmire and Joe can't die or age, but might reference getting older. Minor recurring characters can die, but will return anyway. One-off characters can die permanently, but it doesn't matter because we'll never see them again. The floating timeline has essentially turned Family Guy into a world where causality is optional, mortality is negotiable, and time itself is a flexible concept that bends to serve whatever story the writers want to tell that week. Nothing is permanent except the characters' established roles and relationships. Everything else is negotiable. This brings us to perhaps the most interesting aspect of how Family Guy handles its timeline problems. The show's self-awareness about these contradictions and its willingness to make meta-jokes about them. Because unlike some shows that try to maintain the illusion of coherent continuity, Family Guy openly acknowledges how absurd its relationship with time really is. Family Guy has a long history of breaking the fourth wall, making references to itself as a television show, and commenting on its own production. This meta-humor extends to the show's age and timeline problems. The writers are fully aware that nothing makes sense chronologically, and they've decided to make jokes about it rather than try to maintain a serious continuity. One common type of meta-joke involves characters acknowledging that they've been doing something for an impossibly long time. Peter might make a reference to having worked at the brewery for years, despite the show making it clear that only a short time has passed. Or Meg will complain about being in high school forever, with another character agreeing in a way that breaks the fourth wall. There are also jokes about the show's cancellation and revival. Family Guy was cancelled after 3 seasons in 2002, then brought back in 2005 after strong DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings proved that there was still audience demand. The show has made numerous jokes about this, with characters referencing the cancellation directly or making comments about being brought back from the dead. These cancellation jokes tie into the age problem in interesting ways, and when the show returned in 2005, 3 years had passed in our world, but 0 time passed in Quahog. The Griffin family picked up exactly where they left off, same ages, same situations, as if the cancellation never happened. This reinforced that the show exists outside normal time, able to pause and resume without consequences. The show has also done entire episodes built around time manipulation and acknowledging the weirdness of its own timeline. The Road 2 episodes featuring Stewie and Brian traveling through time, alternate dimensions, and parallel universes all play with continuity in ways that highlight how flexible Family Guy's reality really is. In Back to the Pilot, Stewie and Brian travel back to the very first episode of Family Guy, meeting their past selves and interacting with events from 1999. And the episode makes constant jokes about how different the animation style was, how the characters' personalities have changed, and how much the show has evolved. It's a meta-commentary on the show's own history, wrapped in a time travel adventure. Then there are the Conway Twitty cutaways, which became infamous for bringing the show's pacing to a complete halt. For those unfamiliar, the Conway Twitty gag involved the show cutting away to extended footage of the real-life country singer Conway Twitty performing songs, sometimes for several minutes. These cutaways had nothing to do with the plot. They were literally just Seth MacFarlane filling airtime with music because he liked Conway Twitty. The Conway Twitty gags are relevant to our discussion because they represent the show openly acknowledging that it's a television program with runtime to fill. They break any illusion that we're watching a coherent story with internal logic. Instead, we're watching a variety show that uses the Griffin family as a framework for jokes, cutaways, and whatever else the creators feel like including. This ties into the age problem, because it reinforces that Family Guy isn't trying to tell a linear story with character development over time. It's an episodic comedy where each episode is a self-contained unit, and the story is just an excuse to deliver jokes. Character ages staying constant makes sense in this context because the characters themselves are just vessels for comedy, rather than people with actual lives. The show has done episodes that explicitly make fun of continuity problems. Characters will reference events from previous episodes in contradictory ways. Peter will claim something happened that clearly didn't based on what we saw. The show plays with the idea that memory and history are unreliable, that the past can be rewritten to serve the present needs of a story. There are also frequent jokes about the show's budget, production schedule, and relationship with Fox network executives. Characters will mention being on Fox, reference their time slot, or make jokes about their ratings. This constant acknowledgement that Family Guy is a television show trying to stay on the air undermines any attempt to take the in-universe timeline seriously. And one particularly interesting meta-element is how the show handles celebrity appearances and pop culture references. Family Guy is famous for its cutaway gags, referencing movies, TV shows, historical events, and celebrities. These cutaways often show the Griffin characters interacting with real historical figures or fictional characters from other media. The problem is, these cutaways create impossible timeline contradictions. Peter can't have met Richard Nixon in the 1970s and also be currently in his 40s. The show can't reference events from the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s, as if they all happened recently if the characters haven't aged. But the show doesn't care because the cutaways exist outside the main continuity anyway. This is where Family Guy's approach differs from shows like The Simpsons, which at least tries to maintain some internal logic about what is and isn't canon. Family Guy openly embraces chaos and contradiction. The Treehouse of Horror episodes in The Simpsons are explicitly non-canon, allowing the show to do weird stuff without affecting the main continuity. Family Guy treats almost everything as potentially non-canon, existing in a fluid state where things are real until they're not. The show has done multiple future episodes, showing what the Griffin family will be like years down the line. These episodes show the kids as adults, Peter and Lois as elderly, and various future scenarios playing out. But then the show returns to the present and continues as if those futures don't exist or aren't inevitable. The future is just another playground for comedy, as it's not an actual destination the characters are heading toward. This meta-awareness extends to the show's handling of death. Characters will die in one episode, then appear alive in the next with no explanation. Sometimes there's a throwaway line about how they got better. Other times, the death is simply ignored. The show has established that death isn't permanent unless it needs to be for emotional impact, and even then, it can be undone if convenient. All of this meta-humor serves a specific purpose. It allows Family Guy to have its cake and eat it too. The show can do dramatic storylines with real stakes when it wants to, then immediately undercut those stakes with jokes acknowledging nothing matters. It can reference real-world events to seem current and topical, while keeping the characters frozen at their established ages. It can build on past episodes when it wants continuity, or ignore past episodes when continuity would be inconvenient. The floating timeline combined with aggressive meta-humor creates a show that exists in a permanent state of ironic detachment from its own premise. Family Guy knows nothing makes sense chronologically, and it's fine with that because the show is more interested in delivering jokes than maintaining a coherent universe. The characters are archetypes serving comedic functions, not people with real lives that need to follow logical progressions. This approach has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is tremendous flexibility. The writers can tell any story they want without worrying about continuity or consequences. They can reference any time period, use any pop culture touchstone, and take characters in any direction because nothing needs to fit together coherently. The disadvantage is that it becomes harder to care about what happens to the characters. If nothing is permanent and everything can be undone or ignored, why should viewers invest emotionally in any storyline? Why worry about Peter losing his job when he'll have it back next episode? Why care about relationship drama when the reset button will be hit eventually? Family Guy has essentially made a deal with its audience. The show will provide consistent laughs and familiar character dynamics in exchange for viewers not expecting meaningful character development, logical continuity, or lasting consequences. It's the comedy equivalent of comfort food, predictable and reliable, and never challenging but also never disappointing, because it never promises to be more than what it is. And what it is, fundamentally, is a show where time doesn't work properly, because time working properly would interfere with the comedy formula. The characters can't age because aging would change who they are, and the show needs them to stay exactly who they were when the series found its voice. This brings us to the deeper question that underlies all of this. Why does Family Guy's structure require characters to never age? What narrative purposes does the floating timeline serve? And why would allowing natural aging fundamentally break the show? To answer this, we need to look at how Family Guy tells stories and what functions its characters serve. Our Family Guy operates on an episodic sitcom model where each episode is essentially self-contained. You can watch episodes in almost any order and still understand what's happening because the show resets to a baseline after each story concludes. This is the opposite of serialized storytelling, where episodes build on each other chronologically, and missing episodes means you lose crucial plot threads. The episodic model requires stability. Viewers need to know what they're getting when they tune in. They expect to see Peter as the lovable idiot, Lois as the patient wife, Meg as the teenage punching bag, Chris as the good-hearted dummy, Stewie as the evil genius baby, and Brian as the intellectual dog. These character dynamics are the show's foundation, the baseline that every story departs from and returns to. If characters aged naturally, this baseline would constantly shift. Peter becoming elderly would change how his character functions. He couldn't be the physical comedy guy getting into slapstick situations if he's dealing with the aches and pains of being 70. His man-child behavior would go from childish and funny to sad and pathetic when he's a senior citizen, still acting like an overgrown teenager. Consider what Peter's character actually is. He's an overgrown child in a man's body, someone who never fully matured past adolescence, despite being physically adult and having adult responsibilities. This archetype works specifically because Peter is in his 40s, old enough that his behavior should have improved by now, but young enough that he's still physically capable of the ridiculous adventures the show puts him through. If Peter ages into his 60s and 70s, the archetype stops functioning. An elderly man acting like a teenager isn't charming or funny, it's concerning. It suggests cognitive decline or serious mental health issues rather than harmless immaturity. The show can't do physical comedy with an elderly Peter without it feeling mean-spirited or unrealistic. His drinking habit would raise serious health concerns. His weight would be a legitimate medical crisis rather than a character trait. Peter's job situation also relies on him being middle-aged. He works at the brewery as a regular employee, doing manual labor and taking orders from management. This position makes sense for a guy in his 40s who's been working blue-collar jobs his whole life. But for a man in his 70s, still doing the same entry-level work, and it becomes tragic rather than comedic. The show would have to address why Peter never advanced, never retired, never planned for his future. His friendships with Joe, Quagmire and Cleveland depend on them all being roughly the same generation. They're all middle-aged guys drinking at the bar together, reminiscing about their younger days while still being young enough to get into adventures. If Peter aged normally, his friends would age too, and eventually they'd all be senior citizens sitting around the drunken clam, talking about their medications and funerals. The dynamic would shift from buddies having fun to old men killing time before death. Peter's role as a father requires a specific age relationship with his kids. He needs to be old enough to have teenage and baby children, but young enough that it's not creepy or weird. A father in his 40s with a baby like Stewie is completely normal. A father in his 70s with a baby would raise serious questions about how that happened and whether he can physically keep up with infant care. The physical comedy that defines Peter's character wouldn't work if he aged. He gets into fights with the giant chicken, falls off buildings, gets crushed by heavy objects, and survives impossible injuries. These slapstick moments require Peter to be physically robust, able to bounce back from trauma. An elderly Peter couldn't do any of this without the show becoming dark. We'd be watching a senior citizen getting beaten up and seriously injured, which isn't funny. Peter's ignorance and stupidity work because he's meant to be a guy who peaked in high school and never developed beyond that. And he's the kind of person who knows all the lyrics to 1980s rock songs, but can't name the current vice president. His cultural knowledge froze somewhere around his youth, and he's coasted on that ever since. This character type needs to be middle-aged, old enough that his lack of growth is noticeable, but not so old that he's expected to be wise or at least settled. The show has occasionally imagined elderly Peter, and the results are never positive. Future episodes showing Peter as an old man consistently depict him as even more pathetic than current Peter, having learned nothing and achieved nothing. The show understands that aging Peter would either force genuine character development, which the format doesn't allow, or make him increasingly sad, which would undermine the comedy. A Meg aging out of high school would eliminate an entire category of stories. So much of Meg's character comes from being the unpopular teenage girl dealing with school social hierarchies. High school is a specific crucible of social pressure, hormones, identity formation, and peer judgment. It's a time when social status feels life or death important, when rejection stings with unique intensity, when everything feels more dramatic than it really is. Meg's suffering works comedically, because we know she'll eventually graduate and move beyond these petty teenage concerns. The show can be cruel to her, because we understand high school isn't forever in real life. But if Meg aged out of high school, what happens to her character? The show would need to find new sources of misery for her, new ways to make her the family punching bag. Adult Meg working a job would require different dynamics. Workplace bullying hits differently than high school bullying. It's less cartoonish, more serious, harder to laugh at. Adult rejection and failure carries more weight than teenage social struggles. If Meg aged into her 20s and 30s still being treated terribly, it would stop being funny and become genuinely depressing. The show would essentially be depicting a woman whose life never improved, who remains a loser and outcast into adulthood, which is darker than intended. Meg's relationship with her family also relies on her being a teenager. Parents treating their teenage daughter poorly is bad, but somewhat understandable given teenage drama and parent-teen conflicts, and parents treating their adult daughter the same way would make them seem actively abusive rather than just insensitive. The family dynamic needs Meg to be young enough that their treatment of her, while harsh, doesn't cross into irredeemable territory. High school provides endless story opportunities for Meg. There are always dances, tests, social events, dating scenarios, and academic challenges to mine for plots. If Meg graduated and got a job, the show would need to create entirely new situations for her character. Office comedy is a different beast than high school comedy. The show would essentially need to develop a second tier of supporting characters around adult Meg's workplace and life, which is a lot of effort for a character who's mostly used as a punching bag. Meg's arc is fundamentally about teenage suffering. She's the girl who can't catch a break, who gets rejected and humiliated and overlooked. This resonates because everyone remembers how much high school could suck, how small problems felt huge, how desperate everyone was to fit in. But an adult experiencing the same level of constant rejection would need serious help. It would suggest legitimate social dysfunction rather than typical teenage struggles. Chris growing up faces similar problems. His innocence and stupidity work because he's a young teenager still figuring out the world. He's at an age where it's normal to be confused about sex, to not understand complex topics, to make stupid mistakes based on limited life experience. Chris represents that particular kind of adolescent cluelessness where you think you understand everything, but actually understand very little. If Chris aged into adulthood, this innocence would become concerning. An adult who doesn't understand basic aspects of life isn't charmingly naive. He's cognitively impaired. The show would have to address whether Chris has learning disabilities or developmental issues, which would shift him from comic relief to a character requiring serious support and accommodation. Adult Chris would also overlap too much with Peter. Both would be dumb adult men making stupid decisions. The show doesn't need two variations on the same character type. Chris's youth is what differentiates him from his father. Kid Chris makes dumb mistakes because he's young. Adult Chris making the same mistakes would just be sad, and he'd be redundant with Peter. Chris's storylines revolve around typical teenage concerns: first crushes, figuring out his interests, I'm dealing with school, discovering his identity. These are universal coming-of-age experiences that resonate because we all went through them. If Chris aged into his 20s and 30s, still dealing with figuring himself out, it would suggest he's failing at basic life tasks rather than going through normal development. The relationship between Chris and Meg also depends on their ages. They're siblings close enough in age to interact regularly, but far enough apart to have different experiences. Both are navigating adolescence, dealing with parental expectations, and figuring out who they are. If they aged into adulthood, the show would need to develop new dynamics between them as adult siblings, which is a different relationship than teenage siblings living together. Stewie presents the most obvious problem. His entire character is built on the contrast between baby appearance and adult intelligence. The entire comedy of Stewie comes from watching a baby do things babies shouldn't be able to do. Speak eloquently, build advanced technology, have sophisticated opinions about art and culture, plot elaborate schemes. Remove the baby part, and you've destroyed the core concept. The show has occasionally imagined what adult Stewie might be like, usually depicting him as flamboyantly gay and lacking his current edge. There's an implicit acknowledgement that growing up would ruin what makes Stewie interesting. Baby Stewie is memorable and unique. Adult Stewie would just be another character, no more interesting than any other adult in the show's universe. Stewie's relationship with Brian depends on the baby dog dynamic. A talking baby and a talking dog forming a friendship is inherently absurd and funny. The visual contrast between tiny infant Stewie and full-sized dog Brian creates comedy through size difference alone. Their road trip episodes work because we're watching the smallest and most helpless character paired with a character who, despite being a dog, is one of the most responsible and adult in the entire show. If Stewie grew up, this dynamic would vanish. A child Stewie or teenage Stewie wouldn't have the same contrast with Brian. Adult Stewie would just be Brian's friend, nothing particularly special about it. The entire visual and conceptual comedy of their relationship relies on Stewie being a baby forever. Stewie's plots often involve world domination schemes, violence that would be disturbing coming from an older character, and precocious sexuality that's funny, because he's a baby who couldn't actually act on these impulses. If Stewie was 5 or 10 or 15, these same plots would be genuinely disturbing rather than comedic. A 5-year-old building weapons is concerning. A 10-year-old talking about sex is inappropriate. A 15-year-old plotting murder is terrifying. The show needs Stewie to be a baby because it creates a comedic buffer. We can laugh at his evil schemes and inappropriate comments because he's physically incapable of following through on most of them. He's a genius trapped in the most helpless form possible. If he aged even slightly, he'd become capable of real harm, and the show would have to address the moral implications of his behavior. Stewie's voice is also crucial. Seth MacFarlane performs Stewie with a sophisticated British accent that sounds ridiculous coming from an infant. The contrast between his articulate speech and baby appearance is part of what makes him funny. If Stewie visibly aged, the voice would need to change too. Child Stewie couldn't have the same voice without it seeming forced. The character's core appeal would be lost. But the age problem goes deeper than just individual character dynamics. It affects the show's structural approach to storytelling, particularly its use of cutaway gags. Family Guy is famous for its cutaways, those random tangents where the show cuts away from the main story to show an unrelated scene that illustrates whatever point a character is making. These cutaways can reference any time period, any cultural touchstone, any historical event. Peter might mention something, and we cut away to him meeting Elvis Presley in the 1950s, then cut away to him attending Woodstock in the 1960s, then cut away to him watching the first moon landing in 1969. Within a single episode, the cutaways can place Peter at events spanning decades. This only works if Peter exists outside normal time. If we had to track Peter's actual age and life history, most of these cutaways would be impossible. We'd have to calculate whether Peter was old enough to be at this event, whether he would have been in the right place, whether his life circumstances would have allowed him to be there. The cutaways require temporal flexibility. The cutaway structure is so central to Family Guy's identity that losing it would fundamentally change the show. The ability to randomly insert historical references, pop culture parodies, and absurd scenarios without worrying about continuity is what makes Family Guy distinctive. Many of the show's most memorable moments are cutaways that have nothing to do with the main plot but become iconic anyway. If characters aged and continuity mattered, every cutaway would need to be vetted for chronological consistency. Could Peter really have been at that event in 1985 given his established age? Does this cutaway contradict something we saw in another episode? The freedom to do whatever the joke requires would be lost, constrained by the need to maintain timeline integrity. The same applies to pop culture references. Family Guy references movies, TV shows, songs, and celebrities from the 1950s through today. Characters quote films from before they were born, make jokes about TV shows from decades past, and interact with cultural touchstones from all across American history. This works because the show treats all of pop culture as equally accessible and contemporary, regardless of when things actually happened. Peter can quote movies from the 1960s with the familiarity of someone who saw them in theaters, while also referencing Netflix shows from last month. He knows songs from every decade, fashion trends from multiple eras, and cultural moments spanning 60 years. This impossible breadth of knowledge works because Peter exists in a temporal bubble where his cultural memory extends infinitely in all directions. If Peter aged normally, his cultural references would need to be age-appropriate. He'd remember things from his actual youth, but wouldn't have experienced anything before he was born, and the show would lose the ability to make references spanning multiple decades through a single character. Each character would be limited to their generational knowledge, constraining the range of comedy. There's also the practical consideration of voice actors and production. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and several other characters. Alex Borstein voices Lois. Seth Green voices Chris. These actors have been with the show for 25 years, and their voices have remained relatively consistent because they're adults whose voices don't change dramatically with age. MacFarlane's Peter voice is built around a specific accent and vocal quality that would be hard to age convincingly. If Peter became elderly, should his voice get raspier and weaker? Should he develop an old man quaver? MacFarlane can't actually age his voice 30 years to match character aging. He can do an old Peter voice occasionally for special episodes, but doing it permanently for every episode would be exhausting and might not work long term. Stewie's voice presents an even bigger problem. MacFarlane performs Stewie as a baby with an adult voice, creating that crucial contrast. If Stewie aged, the voice would need to change to match. But changing Stewie's voice means losing one of his most distinctive features. The sophisticated British baby voice is iconic. Toddler Stewie or Child Stewie wouldn't have that same voice, meaning the character would lose much of his appeal. Keeping the characters at fixed ages means the voice actors can keep performing their roles indefinitely without having to modify their performances to account for aging. And this is a huge practical advantage for a show that wants to run for decades. You don't need to recast roles or ask actors to dramatically change their vocal performances as long as the characters never age. The episodic structure also relates to syndication and streaming. Family Guy episodes need to be rewatchable in any order for syndication to work effectively. If you're watching random episodes on cable or streaming, you should be able to understand what's happening without needing to know where that episode falls chronologically in the series. Cable channels can show Family Guy episodes completely out of order, and viewers won't be confused because the characters are always the same. There's no need to track which episodes come before or after others because nothing permanently changes. This makes the show perfect for syndication, where episodes get shuffled and repeated constantly. Streaming services benefit from the same flexibility. Someone discovering Family Guy on a streaming platform can start with any season, watch episodes in random order, or cherry-pick episodes based on descriptions. They don't need to commit to watching hundreds of episodes in chronological order to understand character relationships or track ongoing storylines. Every episode is an equally valid entry point. This is only possible if episodes are self-contained and the characters remain consistent. If characters aged across seasons, early episodes would feel like a different show compared to later episodes. New viewers tuning in randomly would be confused about why the characters look and act differently depending on which episode they're watching. The floating timeline ensures every episode presents the same version of these characters, making the entire catalogue of episodes equally accessible. Think about how this affects the show's commercial value. Networks pay for syndication rights based on how many episodes they can show and how flexibly they can schedule them. A show with strict continuity requires careful scheduling to maintain chronological order. A show with a floating timeline can be shown in any order at any time, maximizing scheduling flexibility and viewer accessibility. Streaming platforms similarly value content that doesn't require commitment. Modern viewers often want to casually watch a show without investing in long narrative arcs. Family Guy's episodic structure with frozen character ages perfectly suits this viewing pattern. You can watch one episode while eating lunch, then not watch again for months, and you haven't missed anything important. There's also the matter of international audiences and delayed broadcasts. Family Guy airs in dozens of countries, often with delays of months or years compared to the American broadcast. Episodes are dubbed into multiple languages and shown out of order. This global distribution model requires episodes to be self-contained and not dependent on strict chronological viewing. If the show had a serialized structure with aging characters, international audiences watching delayed or out-of-order broadcasts would be completely lost. They'd see characters at different ages in random order, creating confusion about the timeline. The floating timeline makes it possible to show episodes in any order in any market, without confusing viewers about basic facts like character ages and relationships. International dubbing also benefits from character consistency. Voice actors in other countries can maintain the same performances across all episodes without needing to account for character aging. Peter sounds the same in Spanish, German, or Japanese, whether the episode was made in 1999 or 2024, because Peter is the same age. Dubbing studios don't need to coordinate aging effects across different voice performances. Family Guy's production schedule also plays a role. As Seth MacFarlane mentioned in that Hollywood Reporter interview, episodes take 12 to 14 months to produce from initial concept to finished animation, and this means episodes being written today won't air until 2027. If characters aged in real time, the writers would need to constantly calculate how old characters should be when an episode airs, then animate them accordingly. This production lag would create constant continuity problems. An episode written in 2025 might show Peter at age 45, but by the time it airs in 2027, later episodes that were written more recently might show Peter at age 47. Episodes would air out of chronological order based on production schedules, creating visible aging inconsistencies that would confuse viewers. The floating timeline eliminates this problem. Writers don't need to worry about when an episode will air or how much time has passed since the last episode. Characters are always their established ages, regardless of production schedules or broadcast dates. This makes the writing process more flexible and reduces the chance of continuity errors. Meg aging out of high school would eliminate an entire category of stories. So much of Meg's character comes from being the unpopular teenage girl dealing with school's social hierarchies. What happens to her character when she's an adult? Does she go to college? Get a job? The show would need to find new dynamics and situations for her, fundamentally changing what a Meg story looks like. Chris growing up faces similar problems. His innocence and stupidity work because he's a young teenager still figuring out the world. Adult Chris would just be a dumb guy, which is essentially what Peter already is. The show doesn't need two bumbling idiots with the same basic character traits. Seeing Chris's youth is what differentiates him from his father. Stewie presents the most obvious problem. His entire character is built on the contrast between baby appearance and adult intelligence. Remove the baby part, and you've destroyed the core concept. The show has occasionally imagined what adult Stewie might be like, usually depicting him as flamboyantly gay and lacking his current edge. There's an implicit acknowledgement that growing up would ruin what makes Stewie interesting. But the age problem goes deeper than just individual character dynamics. It affects the show's structural approach to storytelling, particularly its use of cutaway gags. Family Guy is famous for its cutaways, those random tangents where the show cuts away from the main story to show an unrelated scene that illustrates whatever point a character is making. These cutaways can reference any time period, any cultural touchstone, any historical event. Peter might mention something, and we cut away to him meeting Elvis Presley in the 1950s, then cut away to him attending Woodstock in the 1960s, then cut away to him watching the first moon landing in 1969. Within a single episode, the cutaways can place Peter at events spanning decades. This only works if Peter exists outside normal time. If we had to track Peter's actual age and life history, most of these cutaways would be impossible. We'd have to calculate whether Peter was old enough to be at this event, whether he would have been in the right place, whether his life circumstances would have allowed him to be there. The cutaways require temporal flexibility. The same applies to pop culture references. Family Guy references movies, TV shows, songs and celebrities from the 1950s through today. Characters quote films from before they were born, make jokes about TV shows from decades past, and interact with cultural touchstones from all across American history. This works because the show treats all of pop culture as equally accessible and contemporary, regardless of when things actually happened. If characters aged normally and the show maintained strict continuity, this approach would fall apart. We couldn't have Peter making detailed references to TV shows from the 1970s if he was a young child then. We couldn't have Brian quoting literature from the 1950s if he wasn't born yet. The show's entire reference-based comedy style requires ignoring chronology. There's also the practical consideration of voice actors and production. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and several other characters. Alex Borstein voices Lois. Seth Green voices Chris. These actors have been with the show for 25 years, and their voices have remained relatively consistent because they're adults whose voices don't change dramatically with age. If the characters age naturally, there would be expectations about how their voices should change. Baby Stewie growing into a young child would need a different voice. Teenage Chris becoming an adult would need a voice change. Peter going from middle-aged to elderly would need to sound older and more frail. But the actors can't actually age their voices 25 years worth, because they haven't aged that much themselves. Keeping the characters at fixed ages means the voice actors can keep performing their roles indefinitely, without having to modify their performances to account for aging. This is a huge practical advantage for a show that wants to run for decades. You don't need to recast roles or ask actors to dramatically change their vocal performances as long as the characters never age. The episodic structure also relates to syndication and streaming. Family Guy episodes need to be rewatchable in any order for syndication to work effectively. If you're watching random episodes on cable or streaming, you should be able to understand what's happening without needing to know where that episode falls chronologically in the series. This is only possible if episodes are self-contained and the characters remain consistent. If characters aged across seasons, early episodes would feel like a different show compared to later episodes. New viewers tuning in randomly would be confused about why the characters look and act differently depending on which episode they're watching. The floating timeline ensures every episode presents the same version of these characters, making the entire catalogue of episodes equally accessible. There's also the matter of international audiences and delayed broadcasts. Family Guy airs in dozens of countries, often with delays of months or years compared to the American broadcast. Episodes are dubbed into multiple languages and shown out of order. This global distribution model requires episodes to be self-contained and not dependent on strict chronological viewing. If the show had a serialized structure with aging characters, international audiences watching delayed or out-of-order broadcasts would be completely lost. The floating timeline makes it possible to show episodes in any order in any market, without confusing viewers about basic facts like character ages and relationships. Family Guy's production schedule also plays a role. As Seth MacFarlane mentioned in that Hollywood Reporter interview, episodes take 12 to 14 months to produce from initial concept to finished animation. This means episodes being written today won't air until 2027. If characters aged in real time, the writers would need to constantly calculate how old characters should be when an episode airs, then animate them accordingly. The floating timeline eliminates this problem. Writers don't need to worry about when an episode will air or how much time has passed since the last episode. Characters are always their established ages, regardless of production schedules or broadcast dates. This makes the writing process more flexible and reduces the chance of continuity errors. All of these factors combine to make the floating timeline not just convenient, but necessary for Family Guy to function as the type of show it is. The show could theoretically allow characters to age, but doing so would require fundamentally restructuring how stories are told, how episodes are produced, and how the show is distributed and consumed. It would mean transitioning from an episodic sitcom to a serialized drama with continuous chronology. It would mean giving up the flexibility to set episodes in any time period or reference any cultural touchstone without worrying about continuity. It would mean creating new character dynamics and relationships as the old ones aged out of relevance. And it would mean potentially losing what makes each character distinctive and marketable. The show's creators and network executives clearly decided that these trade-offs weren't worth making. Better to keep the characters frozen at their established ages and maintain the show's successful formula than to age them naturally and risk losing what makes Family Guy appealing to its audience. This is the commercial necessity Ros Kavanagh identified. Shows like Family Guy, The Simpsons, and South Park have become valuable intellectual properties worth hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. That value is tied to specific character configurations that audiences recognize and enjoy. Changing those configurations through aging would jeopardize that value. So the characters stay frozen. Time remains flexible. Continuity is treated as optional. And the show continues generating revenue year after year because it provides reliable, consistent entertainment that never challenges viewers' expectations or requires them to keep track of complex chronologies. But there's one more aspect we need to explore to fully understand Family Guy's relationship with aging and time. Because while the show mostly keeps characters frozen at their established ages, it occasionally breaks its own rules and shows us what would happen if time actually progressed normally. And these glimpses into possible futures reveal a lot about what the show is and isn't willing to do with its premise. Family Guy has done numerous episodes set in the future, as showing alternate timelines where the characters have aged and their lives have progressed beyond the show's eternal present. These future episodes are fascinating because they demonstrate that the show is perfectly capable of imagining aged versions of its characters, but it deliberately chooses not to make those futures permanent. One of the earliest future episodes is Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which was released as a direct-to-DVD movie in 2005 before being broken into 3 episodes for broadcast. The movie shows Stewie as a teenager and then as an adult, exploring what his life becomes when he finally grows up. Adult Stewie is portrayed as flamboyantly gay, working in a dead-end job, having lost his edge and become a fairly conventional character. The movie makes it clear that growing up hasn't been good for Stewie. His adult self is disappointed with how his life turned out, missing the potential he showed as a baby genius. The story ultimately revolves around Stewie preventing this future from happening, essentially ensuring that he stays a baby forever. It's a meta-commentary on why the show can't let Stewie age. Growing up would destroy everything interesting about him. There's also Back to the Pilot, which we mentioned earlier. In this episode, Brian and Stewie travel back to the very first episode of Family Guy, creating an alternate timeline where they interact with their past selves. The episode doesn't show the future directly, but it plays with the concept of multiple timelines and how changing the past affects the present. The episode includes jokes about how different the show's animation was in 1999, how character personalities have shifted over the years, and how much has changed while simultaneously nothing has changed. It's the show acknowledging that it's been around for over a decade, while the characters remain fundamentally the same. Then there are episodes like Stu and Stewie's Excellent Adventure, which show future versions of characters in brief glimpses. These futures are never meant to be definitive or permanent. They're just possibilities, alternate timelines that exist alongside the main continuity without affecting it. The most comprehensive future episode is probably The Big Bang Theory from season 9, which shows multiple possible futures for the characters. In various timelines, we see the Griffin kids as adults, Peter and Lois as elderly, and different outcomes for how their lives might progress. These futures are deliberately varied and contradictory. One timeline shows Meg becoming successful and happy. Another shows her still miserable as an adult. One shows Chris becoming a competent adult with a career. Another shows him still living with his parents as a man-child. The episode makes it clear that these are just possibilities, not destinies. This multiplicity of futures serves an important narrative function. It allows the show to explore what could happen to these characters without committing to any one outcome. It's the having your cake and eating it too approach taken to the extreme. The show can do emotional stories about the kids growing up and moving on, then immediately return to the present, where none of that matters because it hasn't happened yet and might never happen. And the future episodes also tend to be less well received than regular episodes. Fans tune in to Family Guy for the established character dynamics they know and love. Showing those characters aged and changed removes the comfort of familiarity. It's like seeing your favorite comfort food prepared in a completely different way. It might be interesting, but it's not what you wanted. This fan reaction reinforces why the show keeps characters at fixed ages. The audience wants consistency and predictability. They want Peter to be Peter, not elderly Peter or dead Peter or fundamentally changed Peter. The same applies to all the other characters. Their established roles and relationships are what make the show work, and aging would disrupt those roles. There's also the question of what these future episodes reveal about the show's philosophy toward time and continuity. By showing multiple contradictory futures, Family Guy is essentially saying that the future doesn't exist yet and won't exist until the show gets there. The present is all that matters, and the present is perpetual. This ties into the floating timeline concept perfectly. If the present is perpetual and the future is multiple possibilities existing in superposition, then there's no need for characters to age toward any particular destiny. They can remain frozen in the present forever, because the present is the only time that's real within the show's universe. The future episodes also allow the show to comment on its own longevity and legacy. By showing aged versions of characters, the show acknowledges that it can't actually run forever, that there will eventually be an end. But by keeping those endings in theoretical futures that never arrive, the show can keep running indefinitely without committing to when or how it will conclude. This creates an interesting paradox. Family Guy has been on the air long enough that viewers who were children when the show started are now adults, possibly with children of their own. These viewers have literally grown up and aged while the Griffin family stayed the same. The show has become a constant in many people's lives precisely because it never changes. There's something almost mythological about this, which ties back to Kevin Wanner's observation about animated characters functioning like ageless figures in myths. The Griffin family exists outside normal time, are always available, always the same, always ready to provide familiar comfort through predictable character dynamics and humor. But this also means the show can never really end in a satisfying way. How do you conclude a series about characters who exist in perpetual present? Any ending would require breaking the floating timeline and allowing time to progress normally, which would fundamentally change the nature of the show in its final episodes. The Simpsons faces the same problem. Both shows have been on so long that ending them has become almost impossible. Whatever final episode eventually airs will feel arbitrary because the characters aren't progressing toward any narrative endpoint. They're just continuing to exist until the network or creators decide to stop making new episodes. This is the ultimate consequence of the floating timeline. In exchange for the ability to run indefinitely without aging characters, the show sacrifices the possibility of a meaningful conclusion. The characters will never have a final chapter or a sense of narrative closure because their stories aren't building toward anything. Each episode is just another adventure in an infinite series of adventures. The future episodes highlight this by showing possible endings without committing to any of them. The show can imagine how it might end, can explore different emotional beats and character arcs, but then it pulls back and says, actually, none of this is real yet, and it might never be real. It's narrative edging, constantly approaching but never reaching a climax. This brings us to the final piece of understanding Family Guy's relationship with aging and time. The show's cultural impact and what its floating timeline reveals about modern entertainment. Because Family Guy isn't just a TV show making commercial decisions. It's part of a broader shift in how we tell stories and consume entertainment. Family Guy, The Simpsons, South Park, and similar animated shows represent a specific approach to television that emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. These shows are designed to be infinitely rewatchable, endlessly quotable, and perpetually relevant despite never changing their core elements. They're comfort viewing taken to the extreme, offering the narrative equivalent of returning to a favorite restaurant and ordering the same meal every time. And this approach contrasts sharply with prestige television's focus on serialized storytelling with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. Shows like The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, or The Wire tell complete stories with character development, aging, and permanent consequences. Characters die and stay dead. Time progresses naturally. Actions have lasting impacts that shape future episodes. These serialized dramas are designed to be watched once in order, creating a single unified narrative experience. You can re-watch them, but the impact diminishes once you know how the story ends. They're finite by design, with creators planning for specific endpoints and crafting arcs that build toward conclusions. Family Guy represents the opposite approach. It's designed to be watched in any order, at any time, without requiring knowledge of what came before or what comes after. It's infinite by design, with no planned endpoint and no expectation of conclusion. Characters remain static so viewers always know what they're getting, eliminating surprise but guaranteeing consistency. This reflects broader changes in how we consume media. The rise of streaming services and on-demand viewing means people want content they can dip in and out of without commitment. Long-running sitcoms with static characters and episodic structure fit this viewing pattern perfectly. You can watch one episode while folding laundry, then stop and come back months later without missing anything important. The floating timeline is what makes this consumption pattern possible. If characters aged and storylines progressed chronologically, you'd need to watch in order and keep track of where you left off. The static nature of Family Guy means you can watch random episodes whenever you want, and they'll all feel essentially the same. This has made Family Guy incredibly valuable for syndication and streaming. The show's back catalogue of 400-plus episodes is a goldmine because every episode is equally accessible and doesn't require chronological viewing. Networks can show episodes in any order. Streaming services can present them randomly. Viewers can watch whatever episode they feel like without needing to track continuity. The show's refusal to age characters is part of why it's remained culturally relevant despite declining critical reception. Even people who think Family Guy isn't as funny as it used to be still know who the Griffin family is and what each character represents. The consistency of the character dynamics has created a shared cultural understanding that transcends individual episodes. Peter Griffin has become shorthand for a particular type of American man-child. Meg represents teenage suffering and being the family scapegoat. Stewie embodies the evil genius baby trope. These archetypes exist in popular consciousness independent of any specific episode, which is only possible because the characters have remained consistent across hundreds of episodes and 25 years. This cultural impact extends to merchandise, video games, and other media. The Griffin family can be licensed for any time period or context because they don't age and aren't tied to specific moments in history. They're timeless in a way that characters who age naturally can't be. This makes them more valuable as intellectual property. The floating timeline also allows the show to comment on contemporary issues without becoming dated. An episode about current events stays relevant because the characters are always current, regardless of when the episode was made. There's no disconnect where you're watching old episodes and thinking, why are these 40-year-olds dealing with problems from 1999? But this approach has costs. The show can never surprise viewers with genuine character growth or evolution. Everything is predictable. Peter will always be stupid. Lois will always be patient. Meg will always suffer. The comfort of consistency becomes the staleness of repetition. Critics have noted this in their assessments of the show's later seasons. While early Family Guy is often praised for being fresh and edgy, later seasons are frequently criticized for being formulaic and repetitive. The characters go through the same types of conflicts, learn the same lessons they'll forget by next episode, and remain fundamentally unchanged by their experiences. This is the paradox at the heart of the floating timeline. It allows shows to run for decades and remain commercially successful, but it prevents them from telling certain types of stories or achieving certain kinds of emotional depth. You can't have genuine character growth when characters must return to their baseline after every episode, and you can't explore the consequences of aging when characters don't age. Some fans have expressed frustration with this stagnation. They've watched Family Guy for years, growing and changing in their own lives, while the Griffin family remains frozen. There's something unsettling about this disconnect, like the characters are stuck in a loop while the real world keeps moving forward. Yet the show continues to find audiences. New generations discover Family Guy through streaming and embrace it just as previous generations did. The timeless quality that prevents character development also prevents the show from becoming irrelevant. It's always accessible to new viewers because it never requires catching up on years of continuity. This raises interesting questions about what we want from entertainment. Do we prefer stories with definitive endings and character growth? Or do we prefer infinite variations on familiar themes? Do we want to see characters age and change? Or do we find comfort in their eternal consistency? Family Guy's success suggests many viewers prefer the latter. The show's approach to aging and time also reflects how animation itself is perceived in American culture. Animated shows are often seen as less serious than live action, more disposable and ephemeral. The floating timeline reinforces this by treating continuity as unimportant and characters as plastic rather than meaningful. Yet Family Guy has undeniably influenced popular culture and spawned numerous imitators. Its success proved that adult animated sitcoms could run for decades using the same formula. American Dad, Bob's Burgers, and other shows have followed similar patterns, keeping characters at fixed ages while the world around them evolves. The floating timeline has become the default approach for animated sitcoms precisely because Family Guy and The Simpsons demonstrated its commercial viability. It's now the expected format, with shows that try to age characters or maintain strict continuity being seen as unusual exceptions rather than the norm. This represents a fundamental shift in how we tell stories through animation. Classic animated films often featured characters aging and growing with definitive endings and completed arcs. But modern animated television has moved toward perpetual present, endless episodes, and static character dynamics. The medium has evolved to prioritize longevity over narrative completion. Whether this is good or bad depends on what you value in storytelling. If you prioritize comfort, consistency, and infinite rewatchability, the floating timeline delivers. If you prioritize growth, change, and meaningful endings, it frustrates. Family Guy has chosen its audience and its priorities, and that choice is reflected in every decision to keep characters frozen at their established ages. So where does this leave us? We've explored the mechanics of Family Guy's floating timeline, examined the specific age contradictions it creates, looked at how it handles death and permanence, investigated why it's narratively necessary, and considered what it reveals about modern entertainment. What conclusions can we draw about why Family Guy characters never age? The simple answer is commercial necessity. A Family Guy makes money precisely because the characters stay the same. The show's value is tied to the Griffin family as we know them, and changing those characters through aging would jeopardize that value. Networks, creators, and audiences all benefit from consistency, so the floating timeline persists despite its logical absurdities. But there's a deeper answer about what Family Guy is trying to be. The show isn't attempting to tell a realistic story about a family's life over decades. It's creating a comedy engine where established character types generate humor through their interactions with ever-changing situations. The characters are archetypes serving comedic functions, not people with actual lives that need to progress logically. This archetype-based approach requires stability. Peter must always be the lovable idiot. A Lois must always be the patient wife. Meg must always be the suffering teenager. These roles can't change without fundamentally altering what kind of show Family Guy is. The floating timeline preserves these roles by keeping characters frozen at the ages where their archetypes work best. The show has essentially made a pact with its audience. In exchange for reliable, consistent humor based on familiar character dynamics, viewers agree not to expect realistic aging, meaningful character development, or lasting consequences. It's a fair trade for many people, which is why Family Guy remains popular 25 years after its debut. This doesn't mean the show is without problems or limitations. The refusal to age characters creates absurd contradictions and prevents certain types of storytelling. The show can never surprise viewers with genuine evolution or growth. Everything resets to baseline, making each episode feel somewhat disposable and interchangeable. But these limitations are acceptable to the show's creators and audience because they enable the show to run indefinitely without needing to end. Family Guy can keep producing episodes as long as there's commercial demand, unburdened by any requirement to progress toward a conclusion or resolve character arcs. The floating timeline is ultimately about commercial sustainability. It's a storytelling device that allows shows to run for decades, generating consistent revenue. It sacrifices narrative depth and character development in exchange for infinite rerunability and perpetual relevance. It's the television equivalent of a renewable resource, and never depleting as long as there's demand. Whether you see this as brilliant or cynical probably depends on your relationship with entertainment. If you see TV shows as comfort food meant to provide reliable pleasure without challenge or growth, Family Guy's approach makes perfect sense. If you see TV shows as art meant to evolve, surprise, and take risks, the floating timeline feels restrictive and stale. Both perspectives are valid. Family Guy isn't trying to be prestige television or tell deep character-driven stories. It's trying to be a reliable comedy machine that generates laughs through familiar character interactions. The floating timeline serves that purpose perfectly by ensuring the machine always has the same parts operating the same way. The show's longevity proves the approach works, at least commercially. Family Guy has outlasted numerous other animated shows, survived cancellation and revival, and remains a fixture in popular culture. The Griffin family is as recognizable today as they were in 1999, precisely because they haven't changed. That consistency is both the show's greatest strength and its most significant limitation. As we look to the future, it seems unlikely Family Guy will abandon the floating timeline. The show has invested too much in its established formula to change now. Seth MacFarlane has indicated he doesn't see a reason to stop making episodes as long as people are watching, and people are still watching specifically because they know what they're getting. So Peter Griffin will remain in his 40s. Meg will stay in high school. Chris will never graduate middle school. Stewie will be a baby forever. And Brian will continue being the intellectual foil without showing signs of dog aging. The floating timeline will keep floating, time will keep refusing to pass normally, and the contradictions will keep accumulating. This is the bargain Family Guy has struck, and it's a bargain that's worked for over 25 years. The characters will never age because aging would change the show into something different, something that might not work as well or make as much money. Better to stay frozen in perpetual present than risk losing what made the show successful in the first place. The floating timeline isn't a flaw to be fixed. It's a deliberate creative choice that enables a specific type of storytelling. Understanding why Family Guy characters never age means understanding what the show values and what it's willing to sacrifice. It values consistency over growth, familiarity over surprise, commercial sustainability over narrative completion. And as long as audiences keep tuning in for that consistent, familiar, sustainable comedy, the Griffin family will remain exactly as they are, forever frozen at their established ages, living in an eternal present, where time moves forward, but nothing ever really changes. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the weird world of Family Guy's timeline, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the Cartoon Codex for more lore explorations about your favorite animated shows. We've got tons of content about SpongeBob, South Park, and other series where the rules of time and continuity get wonderfully twisted. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss when we post our next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.